Okay, we're recording. Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, good. Tonight we're going to talk about the fourth of the offerings that the book of Leviticus introduces us to, and it's called the purification offerings, or oftentimes we refer to them as the sin offerings. I wanted to start this study tonight with two sections of the book of Romans out of chapter 3, because I think that even though it doesn't apply only to the purification offerings, I have to fit this in to put the purification offering into perspective. So the first quote from Romans 3, verses 5 and 6, Paul is speaking, but if our unrighteousness brings out God's righteousness more clearly, what shall we say? That God is unjust in bringing his wrath on us? I'm using this as a human argument. Certainly not. If that were so, how could God judge the world? Well, we know anybody that has really studied the Bible knows that God has judged the world. The world stands condemned. We are vessels of wrath. And it's this judgment of the world that really gives rise out of God's mercy from his judgment that he has a plan of redemption. Paul continues in chapter 3 in verses 22 to 26 saying, this righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There's no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. God presented him as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood. He did this to demonstrate his justice, because in his forbearance, he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. Those are the key words I'm going to focus on in tonight's lesson. He left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his justice at the present time, the time of Jesus' sacrifice, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus Christ. When you really analyze what Paul is saying in terms of the book of Leviticus and all of these offerings of sacrifice, these laws that we're studying, these sacrifices, these rituals that come out of the book of Leviticus were never intended for salvation. They were prescribed by God for the purpose of God's forbearance or withholding of his judgment until the time that Jesus came. And God provided Jesus as a sacrifice for salvation, not all of these rituals and sacrifices of Leviticus. They did nothing but forbear God's judgment till Jesus finished the work. God never had a plan B. His plan A has been from the very beginning, Jesus, and it was only fulfilled in the completion of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross and his ascension to heaven. So I want to keep that in mind, and we're going to follow the same format where we're going to start with the study, and then we're going to go into the discussion questions. But I'm going to spend a little bit more time with a overview that relates to more than just the purification offerings, but it's important to keep all of this in perspective, because it's very easy as you go through the book of Leviticus to get lost in the forest by looking at all the trees and then trying to figure out where you are. Last week we learned that the free will offerings, which the Israelites were allowed to present to the Lord, enabled the people to draw close to God. Their sin, just the sin of mankind, kept them away from being able to approach God. Only the priest could go into the tabernacle, and only the high priest could go in the most holy place once a year. So these offerings basically were an atonement for the sinful nature of the Israelites, so that they could enter into a fellowship with God, have a relationship with God, who dwelt with them in their encampment. Now, a gift or an offering, the Hebrew word is korban, and we discussed this last week. The people that were making offerings so that they could approach God were bringing their gifts, and these gifts were at various price based upon the well or the situation of the person making the offer. God, in his mercy, didn't require the same costly offering from all the people. If you were more wealthy, you offered a member of your herd, a male member of your herd. Or if you're less wealthy, a goat or a sheep. If you're even less, a bird. And if finally you are able to offer a grain offering, and we're going to see how that applies to tonight's lesson. Before being able to engage in any kind of fellowship or relationship with God, the offerer had to present an offering which atoned for his sin, and this required a blood sacrifice. Throughout all of Leviticus, we're going to always go back to a reference of a blood sacrifice. The life of an animal had to be taken as a substitute for the life of the sinner. And so we concluded last week's lesson with the saying that the book of Leviticus specified the means for God's chosen people to reconcile themselves with their holy God who dwelt with them. It's a bridge of reconciliation which pointed towards Jesus Christ as the only plan for God's salvation. Now, these ritual offerings reflect God's mercy. God had no requirement or obligation to lift this world that he is condemned because of sin and allow the world to be reconciled to himself. God is sovereign, God is all powerful, and he has every right to exercise his wrath, judgment, and punishment for sin. But in his mercy, God chose to do otherwise. And ultimately, otherwise was God's plan with Jesus Christ. Now, this week, we're going to learn that the purification or sin offerings focused on sins which were committed either unknowingly, and later through guilt or other means, the sinner found out what his sin was, or unintentionally, and in some cases, some intentional sins. But these are sins which defiled the tabernacle, or defiled the Lord's holy name, or defiled the whole community, or defiled the individual member of the community. And as we look at these purification offerings, these offerings were made to remove or cleanse that defilement that was created because the actions of the sinner, the actions of the persons that sinned. These purification offerings, like the other ones, were offered by God to reconcile God's people with God by establishing a series of purification offerings which cleansed the priest, or cleansed the entire community, or cleansed the leaders or the people when they committed sins which defiled the tabernacle, the Lord's name, the community, or the members of the community themselves. The main message that I want you to take away from tonight's lesson is that God established the purification offerings in order to teach his chosen people that they were held accountable for the sins they committed, even if the sins were committed unknowingly or unintentionally, and to teach God's people that these sins, if not acknowledged or dealt with, defiled them before the Lord and affected the whole community. So these offerings, just by their nature, explain to the Israelite people, we're held accountable for our sins. Doesn't matter why we committed them or how we committed them or whether we really meant to commit them. Sin is sin to God, and God judges sin. It's that simple. And God also, through these offerings, teaches people that not only are they accountable for sin, but if sin is left out there without any way of being reconciled, then it not only defiles God, and defiles God because God has a right to exercise judgment against sin, but it also has effects or impacts on the whole community. And so as we go through these purification offerings, we want to keep in mind that twofold teaching purpose for these purification offerings, teaching them that sin needs to be judged and people are responsible for the sin. And on the second hand, that sin has to be dealt with because it contaminates God, it contaminates the community. So I want to go with a very simple outline tonight, an overview, and then the purification or sin offerings themselves, discussion questions, and then conclusions and applications. Now, I mentioned before, but I think it bears repeating because, again, we want to be above one tree at a time as we go through Leviticus. There are 5 standard offerings that are set forth in the book of Leviticus. The 3, what we call free will offerings, which we studied last week, which include the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the fellowship offering. And then we have 2 additional ones, the purification offerings and the reparation offerings. Now, when we talk about the purification offerings and the reparation offerings, these were specifically designed to teach God's people about sin and how God looks towards sin and its effect on God and its effect on the community as a whole. Now, the bigger picture that we have to keep in mind is that these ritual offerings were given for several purposes. Now I'm talking about all 5 of them. They were given to reveal the holiness and character of God. As we see what God accepts in these various offerings, we learn more about God's character. We learn that God's standard of holiness doesn't take into account whether you intended to commit sin or didn't intend to commit sin, whether you knowingly committed sin or you didn't. God's holiness is an absolute standard. It also takes into account God's sovereignty. God, in his sovereignty, can do whatever he wants dealing with man's sin, with the sin of the universe. In a moment, God could choose to send a flood and destroy all of mankind. Oh, he already did that. And he promised never to do that again. But God can do what God wants. And man doesn't really have a whole lot of choice in the matter. We also know that God is a God of mercy and love. And God, in his sovereign exercise of mercy and love, chose to give the Israelites a means by which they can be reconciled to God, all pointing to Jesus Christ, which was God's only plan of salvation. So when we see all these things together, look at these offerings as a gift from God. God didn't have to give us the gift, but he gave the Israelites the gift of reconciliation through these offerings. And this was done, a gift out of God's mercy to forbear God's judgment against sin. We know through the Old Testament and throughout history, God has used natural disasters, evil, and other realities to demonstrate his righteousness and mercy. We always have that troubling question: why does God permit evil? Well, God does permit evil. He allows it to happen. And when we are faced with evil in a world of calamities, natural calamities, or moral degradation, or spiritual warfare that exists, God uses those for the purpose of showing his glory, showing his power, showing his mercy. And so it becomes a starker contrast. If we never faced evil, we would never realize the magnitude of God's glory. And so we have to continually remind ourselves that God is and remains sovereign. and to remind ourselves that even though God permits evil, he doesn't create evil. Evil exists. He allows it to happen. He uses it for his glory. So in his mercy, God has proposed what we're going to study in Leviticus and what we find out in what Jesus Christ accomplished on the cross. In his mercy, he shows his power to overcome evil and his glory and righteousness. That's kind of what we introduced this discussion tonight with when we look at Paul and what he said in Romans. Now, because of the nature of this class and the number of details, the number of bushes and trees that talk about purification, I'm going to leave the study of reparations or the final offering to next week's lesson. I couldn't get it all in. In addition, I admitted the scriptures that deal with the purification offerings. I found, as I really initially drafted it, by reading the scriptures and then trying to explain the scriptures, I was confusing myself. And if I confuse myself, I'd end up confusing you guys. So you can open your books to Leviticus chapters 4 and the first part of chapter 5 and kind of follow along. But what I tried to do in this lesson is take and extract that information and organize it in a way so that you can know what these purification offerings are and how they work together. Now, the purification offerings dealt with ritual impurity or with various unintentional and intentional sins. Ritual impurity, something that you do that prevents you from drawing close to God, from participating in all the things that God asked the Israelites to do, attending the feast, celebrating the Passover. All these ritual impurities prevented people from being able to participate in all the things that God was offering in his relationship with the Israelite people. And it also deals with both an unintentional and intentional sins. The use of the term purification offering instead of sin offering really better describes the purpose behind the offering. Sin causes us to feel dirty. Sin is an impurity in human life. And this defilement and impurity are part and parcel of what sin is all about. So when we have committed sins, whether knowingly, unknowingly, intentionally, or unintentionally, it dishonors God because God is a God of justice. God is a God of judgment of sin. And for God not to deal with sin, that creates a problem with God being God. And so impurity or defilement puts challenge on God, and God in his mercy deals with sin by the very things that he's talking about in Leviticus, ultimately Jesus Christ. Also, sin has an impact on the priesthood, the community, the nation as a whole, and the individual. A person that commits sin, when they find out about the sin, they feel guilty. At least most people feel guilty, even if they don't admit that they feel guilty. When you've committed a sin, you feel like not only guilty that you did something wrong, but you also feel unclean. So when we talk about sin, the scriptures really talk about intentional sin. And there's a whole lot of literature out there. And in law school, if you want to spend 2 or 3 classes, try to make the distinction between what we call sins of commission versus sins of omission. Sins of commission are sins that are the result of an act. Eli's sons committed a sin of commission or an act when they took meat that belonged to God on the burnt offering, the fattest part of the meat, and they took it from the people and take it to themselves. That was a defilement of the ritual, and that was a sin of commission. But if you get a sharp law school, he can turn it into a sin of omission, saying they omitted obeying the law that required them. it just is, it's a useless exercise to talk about the difference. But what we're really talking about is sin is always an act on the part of the sinner. And so when we look in the book of Leviticus, we're going to get into a section later on of Leviticus where we talk about unclean acts or acts by the individual. That's a reference point that you could come back and tie into this part of Leviticus and what the purification offerings are all about. I abandoned that effort very quickly. I'm just going to stay with the purification offerings and what they're talking about. We'll get to the unclean acts later on. Now, one thing that all the purification offerings have in common is what I call the base ritual of atonement. Well, what's the base ritual of atonement? We already studied that last week. It's where the offerer follows a pattern when he makes his offering in the courtyard. He brings the specified offering, whether an animal, grain, or birds, or whatever. In some cases, and the animal always has to be an animal without defect. The flour always has to be the finest flour. And he brings it to the entrance of the tent of the meeting before the brazen altar. And then he performs the hand leaning rite, where he puts his hand on the sacrifice, the animal to be sacrificed, and he either announces to the priest the purpose of the offering, or in cases of purification, he confesses his sin. But in it, the hand leaning rite is part of this pattern that goes across all of these offerings. And then it's followed by the animal being slaughtered by the priest and the priest doing the blood rituals. So that's a basic pattern. That's the base that all of these offerings start with. It's after you follow this basic pattern of offering that the requirements for the purification offerings start to go in different directions. The purification offerings are basically divided into two groups. The one group is the offerings that are required when the high priest commits a sin, or the congregation, the whole community commits a sin. That's group one, the high priest and the whole community. The second grouping of the purification offerings is when the leaders of the community or the members of the community individually themselves commit the sin. So group one, the high priest and the whole community. Group two, the leaders of the community and the members of the community. So let's talk about the purification offerings for group one, the high priest or the whole community. Now, if the purification offering is for the high priest or for the whole community, this requires the high priest. No other priest can be involved in this. A purification offering for the high priest himself or for the whole nation has to be performed by the high priest himself. And he has to make that offering on behalf of himself and the whole community. Now, the purification offering required of the high priest, it required a sacrifice of a bull. No other animal sacrifice was allowed. This was required the high priest to do. The next step is the blood from the sacrifice bull, sacrificed by the high priest, was taken by the high priest into the tabernacle itself. So what we have here are very serious impurities or sins that really were an affront to God. And it required the high priest to act with a bull that he slaughtered and then take the blood from the bull into the tabernacle. And he went into the tabernacle to cleanse the most holy place from that impurity and to cleanse the holy place. So he cleaned the most holy place by taking the blood from the bull, and he went behind the golden altar and stood before the veil, and he sprinkled the blood of the bull 7 times before the veil. And that ritually cleansed the most holy place. And then he took the bowl with the blood in it and he went around to the golden altar of incense and he put the blood on the four horns of the golden altar. And that symbolically cleansed the holy place. So the actions of the high priest going into the tabernacle was the purposes of purifying the tabernacle so man could approach God. If the high priest failed to do that, how could he enter in there on a daily basis and lift up incense prayers to God? How on the Day of Atonement could he go through the veil into the most holy place? Because it was contaminated by the sin of the high priest or the whole community. So after he ritually cleansed the tabernacle itself, the rest of the blood of the bull was poured out at the brazen altar in the courtyard. Now, what about the bull? When you have a purification offering made by the high priest for sin of the high priest or the whole community, only the fat portions of the bull were burned on the brazen altar. The rest of the entire animal was taken 2 miles outside the camp, and that's where it was burned on the ashes. And that was a ceremonial pure area, but none of the rest of the bull was consumed by the brazen altar in atonement for God, or nor was it ever shared between the priest and the altar. The entire bull, except for the fat portions, burned outside the camp. So when we look at this offering, the high priest and the whole community, we're talking about a pretty serious thing. And when we talk about the next grouping of offerings, we're going to see that the standards are different. For the purification offering for the leaders of the community, or for the regular citizen or member of the community who commits these type of sins, they're not required to sacrifice a bull. They can sacrifice something else, a female goat or a male goat, or they can sacrifice doves, or even offer a grain offering. And the sacrifice did not have to be performed by the high priest. It could be performed by any priest. So when when we have a leader that commits a sin, he presents a male goat, and the regular citizen a female goat or sheep, or in some cases they can offer a grain offering. So we see an elevation or a requirement of less value to the offering because the sin isn't as pervasive and it doesn't contaminate the tabernacle, but it still has to be dealt with. The blood of the sacrifice was placed on the horns of the brazen altar. No blood was taken into the tabernacle, but it was placed on the altar. And the remainder poured out around the altar of the brazen altar that's in the courtyard. The fat of the sacrificed animal was burned on the brazen altar, but the rest of the animal was given to the priests as food. See the difference between the purification offerings and how they work. Now, there's some other details that I want to talk about these purification offerings. Let's go back to the purification offering of the high priest. Why are the requirements for a bull and for a cleansing of the tabernacle, the holy and the most holy place, and for none of the bull to be consumed? Well, what did the high priest represent? He was a single mediator between God and the nation. And so his sin would interfere with God's mercy and grace to the people of Israel. His status in the community required an elevated offering. Also, would be the consequence if the high priest didn't deal with his sin? Well, if God's lifted his favor, what happens with Israel? And we see this throughout the Old Testament. God withholding his favor from the community or from the nation, they were defeated by Israel's enemies. A drought would come, a famine, or a crop failure. God used these events to say to the high priest, you got to deal with your sin. Now, what ultimately is the greatest sin of a high priest? the rejection of our Lord Jesus Christ. And what was God's withholding of favor? I can recall the scriptures where Jesus, his last day before he was taken as a prisoner and crucified, he's returning from Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives, and he looks back and he tells his disciples, there'll be a time when no stone will be left on top of each other in this temple. The sin of the high priest in calling Jesus Christ a blasphemer, calling the Lord himself, and what was the consequence? God's favor of the whole judicial system, the whole sacrificial system, was that it would be taken down. And it was. In 70 AD, the whole temple, the whole sacrificial system, it was completely destroyed by God. And so what we have here is the most blazing example of what happens when the high priest rejects God. So this cleansing ritual, could the high priest, having rejected Christ, repented of his sins and gone and done a bull offering? Well, yeah, that's academic, because that didn't happen. He blasphemed the Lord Jesus as our God, and the consequences flowed. This sin of a high priest is definitely a sin against God. So let's go back to the purification offerings on behalf of the entire community. These were sins that were committed by the community as a whole. I tried to get some examples of this, and I can think of, how about the sin that the entire community committed when they entered into a treaty with the Jebusites, violating God's command not to enter into a treaty with any Gentile nation in the promised land. Well, why did they enter into that treaty? The Gibeonites lied to them. They didn't know better, but nevertheless they sinned. And there were consequences to the whole nation of Israel, because they entered in a treaty with a Gentile nation that they weren't supposed to. I think they also committed a community sin when they rejected the message from 12 spies and were fearful of going into the promised land. The consequences to the whole community, they ended up going in the wilderness for another 40 years because they rejected the promise of God. So these are examples of unintentional sins, or sins that they didn't really think were sins, that there were consequences to the whole nation, to the whole community. Now, when the purification offering is made on behalf of the whole community, it's the same as for the high priest, but there are several differences. You can't get 1 million people to come in there and do the lean offering, or the lean on the head of the bull. What you have to do is get representatives, and so the elders are the ones that put their hand on the bull for the sin of the whole community. And so they represented the whole community. And instead of the high priest doing a sprinkling of the blood on the horns of the brazen altar, any priest could perform that function. Now, as a result of the priest making the atonement on behalf of the offerers, the whole community was forgiven. And if you read carefully Leviticus, this is an added result of making this purification offering. We're introducing the concept of forgiveness for sin that is demonstrated in this offering. And it also continues to reflect the cleansing of impurity by the blood of the animal, and the ransom for the payment of sin, ransom payment for sin, because the life of an animal was taken in substitution for the sinner. Okay, that's that first group. Let's talk about the purification offerings for the leaders. The leaders are that second group. And in that second group, the leaders who occupied, the leaders represented those that represented important positions within the community. They could be an elder, a clan leader, a military commander, any type of person that was in a leadership role. When they committed a sin, intentional or unintentional, or they didn't know whether it was sin, a knowing sin, their purification offering was required whenever the leader suffered from guilt which arose from the sin he committed, and or whenever that sin became known to him. Um, we have King David, and he committed the sin with Bathsheba, and he didn't want to deal with it. As a leader of the community, his sin became known to him when his prophet told him. He used an example, and then he said, and David recognized his sin against God because of what he had done. And coming face to face with it, then he would be a leader required to make a purification offering. And so those are an example of what that. The ramifications of a sin committed by a leader of the Israelite community was still serious. Look what happened after David committed his sin to there was a civil war. No longer was there a period of peace. And it wasn't a war against the Philistines, it was a war against his own son. And so the sins of a leader do have an effect on the whole community. They're not as pervasive or serious as a sin committed by the high priest, but they are sins that have significance. Now, the purification offerings for the ordinary citizen or member of the community, they were able to sacrifice either a female goat or female sheep. And God's instructions for the purification offerings for ordinary citizens then gets down to identifying 3 specific sins that apply to them. This is different because before there were no specified sins. But for the ordinary person, the person that just goes about living his life, there are 3 sins that the scriptures specify that require that member of the community to make a purification offering for himself. The first one that is given is failing to give testimony. What we're talking about here is if you are a witness to a crime and you fail to come forward and give evidence or testimony regarding that crime, then that's a sin that requires a purification offering. This sin occurs when the witness has knowledge of a crime and for any reason he fails to come forward. He could fail to come forward I came up with a couple of reasons here, because of friendship with the person that committed the crime, because of shame about the crime, or because of fear of retaliation. He might not want to come forward because he's indifferent. He doesn't care about it. Or he might have been involved as an accessory with the commission of the crime. Here, what God is really addressing in failure to give testimony is the failure or the inability of the nation to dispense justice. When people don't come forward and give testimony about a crime, crimes go unsolved. They go there without justice. And God wants his community to be a community of justice. It requires witnesses to give testimony. And so when they don't do that and they're confronted with it, then they're required to make a purification offering. The second category of sin that requires a purification offering from a member of the community is dealing with ritual impurity. Ritual impurities involve uncleanliness, which results from touching a carcass, a dead carcass, or having contact with human uncleanliness. It could be anything from a discharge from the human body, an infection from the human body, or any other thing that is unclean. And we'll get to the cleanliness later on. But the point is that these type of sins create an impurity that prevents the person from participating in other ritual activities. And so because these people are disqualified because of their uncleanness, they can deal with the impurity by a purification offering. And in some cases, the wrongdoer, they may not be aware that he had contact with something that was unclean that made him ritually impure, but when he finds out, he has to deal with it. The final sin that's listed for the member of the community to have a purification offering is failing to fulfill an oath. It was a practice in Israel at the time that whenever somebody made an oath, they made an oath swearing upon the Lord's name. And what they're really saying is, may God punish me if I don't fulfill the promise I'm making to you, or may God punish me if I'm lying to you. So if I swear on the Lord's name that this is true and I'm lying, I have committed a violation of my oath, the sworn oath. And in order to be purified of that impurity of sin, I have to make a purification offering. This is profanes the Lord by the member, because swearing upon the Lord means that you're expecting the Lord to do something if you violate the oath. And if God doesn't, then how does God look? And so it's putting God to a test that God shouldn't be put to a test on. Now, that doesn't mean that a person keeps an oath in order not to violate this provision requiring a purification offering. There's in the book of Judges, a judge swore on oath to God that if God gave victory against his enemies, he would sacrifice the first thing that he saw. Well, he had the victory, and the first thing was his daughter. And his daughter, he sacrificed his daughter in order to keep the oath. And I asked myself, why didn't he just go and do a purification offering? God did not require this judge in the book of Judges to sacrifice his daughter just to fulfill an oath. That's a greater evil than violating the oath. And God had a means of atonement, a purification for that sin. Now, whenever a member of the community was required to make a purification offering, when he put leaning of hands, he would have to confess his sin. Not only do we have in these purification offerings forgiveness for sin, but now we have the additional requirement of confession of sin. And so God also says, well, now this is a purification requirement that is for all members of the community, rich, middle class, or poor. And so God, in his mercy, provided a purification offering which applied to the wealth or standing of the individual. Most of the wealthy would be required to offer a sheep or a goat, an animal. And blood of the animal was sprinkled on the altar, and then the animal fat was burned on the altar, and then the meat was shared. Well, if you couldn't afford to make the offering of a member of the flock, an unblemished member, God provided for the offering of birds. Well, the requirements, because this is not an offering that you just do for fellowship. This is an offering for sin. You still have to meet the requirements of blood on the altar, meat for the priest, and then you have the fat of the animal burned on there. Well, wonder if you're allowed by God to offer birds instead of an animal. Well, if you look at the way that offering is made, it was two birds. One bird was made for the blood and the fat on the altar, and the other was for the offering of the meat offering to the priest. And so you had in two birds what would fill the requirements for the purification offering. God even allowed for those that could not afford to make an offering of two birds to make a grain offering. This is different because usually grain offerings weren't for any kind of atonement, but for a purification offering for a member, and one of these three sins committed by a member of the community, God did offer and allow or permit a grain offering. The priest would take the grain offering was different because it did not include oil or frankincense. The high priest would take the portion, the memorial portion of the grain. Remember, it was divided into two portions, one for the priest, one for the altar. The high priest would take the grain offering without oil, without frankincense, and he would burn this portion on the altar on top of other burnt offerings being made at the time. It's kind of hard to burn grain on an altar without having something else to help you consume it. When he did make this grain offering, then the priest was required to ask God to forgive the sin by the offerer of the grain offering. How much God in his mercy, he takes care of all the details for purification from sin. So we that pretty much gives you about more than you ever want to know about purification offerings. But if you really look at the big picture, how much God in his mercy provides for all the different type of sins that up until this time, most people didn't. How many people in the world back at that time even considered what they were doing as a sin against God? God was using these purification offerings to tell the Israelite people, you are responsible for sin, unintentional, unknowing, intentional. You have to be, it defiles me as your holy God, and it defiles you and your community. And so these purification offerings were made, allowed by God so that people could recognize and deal with their sin. They foreshadowed our Lord Jesus Christ. And I repeat again, because it's such an important thing, none of these sacrifices provided for salvation. All they did is forbear God's judgment against sin. And Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected and ascended to heaven. He was God's only plan for salvation. And these things just forbore or abated God's punishment until Christ came. I return to Paul in Romans 3, verses 22 through 26. And Paul says, God did this to demonstrate his justice, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his justice at the present time, the death, resurrection, ascension of Jesus Christ, so as to be just and the only one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus Christ. So with that, I'm going to end the study portion of this lesson dealing with the purification offerings. And so I want to jump to the conclusions. In his mercy, God established the free will, purification, and reparation offerings to teach his people that they are to be held responsible for their sins, and that they were required to offer sacrifices of atonement in order for God to forbear and abate carrying out his wrath, judgment, and punishment for sin until that point in history when the requirements of God's holiness were satisfied by Jesus Christ. The value of the sacrifice was dictated by the position and wealth held by the sinner, so that no sinner was precluded from making a sacrifice acceptable to God because of his position or wealth. It's kind of the point that Dwayne was making. God's provision of a means for atonement through the offerings which God was willing to accept reflected God's mercy and love toward those he chose to redeem. The offerings not only taught God's people what sin was, but also revealed God's character. So next week we'll get into the reparation offerings, but I hope you got as much out of this as I did. It gets into a lot of trees though.